Welcome, everyone. My name is Bianca. I'm with the Global Secretariat of the Men Engage Alliance. If you are on social media, you can follow, you can tweet, etc. The hashtag is Ubuntu Symposium or Symposia Ubuntu in Spanish. And now I'm going to hand over to Gary and Celine, and they will take on this session. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Bianca. And thank you to the Men Engage Global Symposium, the organizers and the Global Secretariat for allowing us to have this session. We've been inspired by the many events and the content that's come through the symposium in all these weeks and months now, and thrilled to have an opportunity to share some emerging ideas from a new initiative that we're calling the Global Boyhood Initiative, of how do we look at the structural and systemic issues that we've been talking about throughout the symposium from a life cycle approach of thinking about bringing boys into a feminist agenda from the earliest ages. This initiative builds on lots of important work over the years from many Men Engage partners, particularly those working in the children's rights space. And I'm thrilled that we have many of them joining us today to be able to share their experiences. The idea of the Global Boyhood Initiative is built in a quite simple idea and a powerful one, we think, embodied in the expression that some of you know, that the US abolitionist and formerly enslaved individual Frederick Douglass said that it is easier to build strong children than it is to fix broken men. And we think that idea of looking at the structural, looking at a life cycle approach of understanding how patriarchy and misogyny, the roots of violence against women, and many other of the challenges that we respond to as organizations, how much of the roots of those are in childhood. How can we build on the important work that's been done to empower adolescent girls and the girl child around the world to think about bringing boys into a world that that fully lives up to a feminist agenda? I'm going to start off with an introduction, and then I will introduce and hand over to Celine Bonner, the ED of the Caring Foundation, which is the partner and co-author with Promundo of the Global Boyhood Initiative. And then we'll have a panel discussion with a number of colleagues who have been working on these issues for a number of years. We'll have, and then we'll have a presentation as well from one of the research projects that's helped frame how we use the media to engage as allies in this work. And we'll have a breakout room that will share some more details when we get to that. As Bianca says, please keep in mind the session is being recorded, and we have English and Spanish translators. So you can click on the right-hand side on the interpretation if you need to do that. Great. Alexa, if you'll pass on to the next one. So this is where we start. We come into this discussion about boys and about boyhood with a positive approach that we believe boys will be their wonderful, complex, healthy, emotional selves with our help. That boys come into the world like girls with the ability to love and the need to be loved and cared for, that our relational selves is the best of who we are. And that's the spirit we believe behind Ubuntu sessions as well. And we believe that they must be feminist allies, that the world that we construct around boys must make clear to them that we believe in a world where equality must be, that it's not an option, it's not an afterthought, but that boys feel that and live that in all of their interactions. The next, please. So why now? Why boyhood? As I mentioned before, a lot of this work is rooted and inspired by many of the Men Engage partners who for years have worked on a children's rights perspective, bringing in a life cycle perspective. We also listened to parents during this time. The power of the Me Too movement of its many years, not just the last few, and global feminist activism has led lots of parents to say, how are we raising our sons? And how can we raise them to be the feminist allies that they should be next to their empowered sisters? We certainly think that is a moment that calls us to talk to boys at younger ages. We also are driven by developmental science that affirms how much the actions of adult men, whether harm or care, are often rooted in childhood experiences. And how do we use that science and that understanding to frame what we do? And then COVID has brought, apart from all of the huge harm to economies, to households, the burden of care work, the job loss that women have experienced disproportionately around the world, there's also been a concern about online spaces And we'll talk a little bit about that and certainly in some of the research that we'll share in terms of what boys and girls are being exposed to. We've had many sessions during Ubuntu about growing white supremacist movements, and the importance of engaging and policing and online spaces in terms of promoting healthy masculinities rather than harmful white supremacist ones. And then we also acknowledge that much of our work to engage adult men is sometimes reactive, it's sometimes small scale, it's sometimes too late, or it is later than it should be in terms of engaging households and communities and institutions in conversations about how to bring children into an equitable world. So what we're doing in the initiative, what we hope to do is to center male allyship in childhood and see how that brings with a children's rights, a feminist, and a structural perspective. It is about individual boys and caregivers, but it's also about the structures around them, about how we make childhood, whether we make a childhood that's free of violence, free of domination, free of sexism, or one that lives up to the full sets of rights that all children deserve. Next, please. We also see the campaign and the initiative as contributing to ending men's violence against women. We know from our research and images, the International Men and Gender Equality Survey carried out in nearly 50 countries around the world, and much other research, particularly some of the important, the key research on women's experiences of violence globally, that one of the strongest factors of an individual man's use of violence against a female partner as an adult is his exposure to violence and other adverse experiences in childhood. We know that we've got to look at trauma as a driver, in addition to domination and patriarchy and the lack of a coordinated response on the part of the state. We know that what happens to children during childhood, girls who may witness it and go on to be in violent relationships, boys who witness it and may go on to use it, is a huge factor that we need to take into account as we look to end violence against women. We know that the attitudes that boys are socialized into around violence against women also influences. We know that whether boys perceive that other men get away with using violence against women or other forms of violence and don't get called out, whether from a legal response or whether from the response of households and communities. And we also know that we must build on the resistance that most men don't use violence. Many men and boys are negatively harmed by violence they see around them. But the need to build a system overall that says we must start in childhood as we look to end violence against women globally. The next one, please. So we are, as I said before, looking at how do we rethink boyhood from individuals to systems. The education system, workplaces, the media, which we'll talk a lot about, the social spaces where boys interact, whether in communities, sports, and other groups, the multiple institutions where children interact with public services, childcare, healthcare, and others, and of course, individuals, children themselves, households, those who make boyhood every day are really where we're aiming to intervene with this initiative. The next one, please. And finally, we've been using research to frame the conversation. We did we did an online survey with parents of boys in the US at the beginning of the COVID lockdowns, and we also did a review of what's out there in the literature around boyhood, focusing first in the US. We'll subsequently be going to partnering in Mexico, as well as partnering in the UK, France, and Italy, among other countries. And there's already some partnerships going on in a few other countries that we'll hear about in Europe. What we found in our first conversation with parents and with boys in the US is that there's a lot of parents who are concerned about how their sons are raised. They do perceive there is something that doesn't work about a misogynist, often emotionally repressed and stoic form of masculinity, that these forms of masculinity don't serve our sons and we need to change them, and that they don't serve daughters and individuals of all sexual identities and orientation. So the importance, but we've also found an important political riff. Those who reported they voted in conservative ways were much more likely to push back on messages about healthy masculinity. They were concerned about their sons, but often more concerned their sons would be unjustly called out for some harm. So we've got a lot of work to think about how extremist and sometimes conservative political views are also something we've got to think about as we design the programming. And then we looked at policies in the US and what's available there. And of course, affirm how much we must think about boyhood and manhood as one of the issues. But we also have to look at how poverty interacts with this. We're very aware of how repressive and punitive policies in schools and the juvenile justice sector police the bodies of boys of color in particular in the US, of how housing and income challenges continue to shape the boyhoods and the childhoods in general of the lowest income and most vulnerable populations. So we see this within a social justice perspective as well. And finally, the media worlds and the online worlds. And Madeline Denono from the Gina Davis Institute, who has been a partner in us shaping this as well, will present later on the study that we did about what boys are seeing on television. So I wanted to give you a little bit of a grounding there. And now I'm pleased to turn it over to Celine Bonner. The Caring Foundation has been an ally and co-author of this from the beginning. And so I'm pleased to ask Celine to talk about what is it that we're planning to do. Celine, over to you.
Thank you, Gary. Hi, everyone. I'm really pleased to be part of this symposium. Thank you for the invitation on this very important topic. Before starting, a few words about the Caring Foundation that was created 13 years ago. And the foundation is fully dedicated to combating violence against women. And we act at 3 levels, through flexible funding to local organizations that support women survivors. And today I would like to pay a tribute to this crucial work done by feminist organizations, and in particular in times of COVID. Beyond this important work, we also focus our attention to preventing the violence in the first place. And to do that, we work with the youth, and in particular with young men and boys. And I come back to this second focus. And thirdly, we bring on board other players to take collective actions, and in particular, the private sector. So, as Gary mentioned it, we know that restrictive ideas about boyhood are reproduced generation to generation in families, in schools, in the sports, in media. And so with Promundo, we want to break this pattern. And we launched the Global Boyhood Initiative in the US last year to target younger boys from 4 to 13 years old. We believe that through some guidance from the adults in their lives, boys will be able to be themselves. And when you ask them, boys start with really healthy aspirations of manhood. And most parents as well want healthy masculinity for their sons. But boys are particularly hesitant to share fear and insecurity, to show their weaknesses. So from the different pieces of research that Gary introduced, we decided to focus our initiative on 4 main pillars in order to guide boys to share emotions in healthy ways, accept and connect with others, break free from stereotypes, and stand up and speak out against all forms of inequality and discrimination. Next slide, please. So our work has an eye for long-term systems change, ensuring that we impact every level of the child's environment. So we started with the pieces of research. Then we built a digital platform with tools and content to provide the young boys and the adults, be it teachers, parents, coaches, with the resources that they need, so that boys can become men who embrace healthy masculinity and gender equality. We also had a public-facing media, and I'll come back to that, and a network of partners dedicated to reaching the boys and the adults. Next slide. So we created content to be shared across different channels, with a diverse set of influencers, as you can see, actors, musicians, illustrators, who shared their own experience of masculinity, as well as the experience of being a father of young boys. So you have different formats, videos, articles, testimonials, and a card deck as a conversation starter with the kids. Next slide, please. So along the way, partners have joined Promundo and the Caring Foundation, such as Plan International and Gucci Chime for Change. And while we are working now on the crucial phase of implementation in the US with the Boys and Girls Club of America, We are really excited to bring this initiative to Mexico and Europe with the support of Panelists. We want to change the narrative and to transform mentalities, in particular in the UK, France, and Italy to begin with. And we will have this same 3-step approach with a research phase with parents and kids. Then we'll build tools and awareness and engagement. And eventually, by building strong partnerships with the local organization that work directly with the boys. And we also want to get into the education system as much as we can. So these partnerships will help us understand the local context and the challenges that boys face in each of these countries, and then help us build an effective program to promote healthy masculinity, gender equality, and combat violence against women. So we hope you'll join us. We look forward to working together to make this very important change happen. Thank you.
As I mentioned earlier, where we see the Global Boyhood Initiative is building off lots of years and lots of tremendous experience about how do we think about social learning and the socialization of boys and girls from younger ages, and how norms and power and dominance get internalized from the youngest ages. So we've invited a few of our key colleagues and partners to share some of their experiences. We don't pretend that the Global Boyhood Initiative starts from zero, that we're the only ones who have ever considered working on this topic. On the contrary, we see it as trying to create a learning network in partnership with Men Engage and many other organizations to exchange lessons learned, research program approaches, advocacy platforms, to work together for this promise of engaging boys from early on in a feminist agenda. So I'm thrilled now to have several panelists who are going to share their experiences with us. We'll have Rodrigo Barraza Garcia, who's the programs manager for the Global Fund for Children. We'll have Catherine Gilmore, who is the UK program officer, also with the Global Fund for Children. We'll have Danielle Molina, who's the regional gender and inclusion specialist for Plan International's regional office for Latin America and the Caribbean. And then we'll have Anthony Keaty, who is the Masculinities Technical Advisor with Abad in Lebanon. And finally, we'll have Tatiana Moura, who's a senior researcher and the coordinator of Promundo Portugal. Thrilled to have all of you with us. So I'm going to jump into our questions. If you'll, I'll start with Rodrigo. Rodri, tell us about the work. The Global Fund for Children has inspired us for a long time with your look at boys and at healthy boyhood, your work in Latin America and elsewhere. Tell us about that work, the work that you've supported over the years engaging boys. What works to bring boys and those around boys into a conversation around healthy masculinity?
Muchas gracias, Gary. Gracias por la pregunta y también muchas gracias por la invitación a estar aquí al lanzamiento de esta iniciativa tan importante y tan poderosa. Antes de responder tu pregunta, compartir muy brevemente acerca del trabajo que hacemos en el Fondo Global para la Niñez. Somos una organización bastante joven, empezamos en el 94, comenzamos en el año 1994, y aunque estamos basados en Washington, D.C., pues trabajamos en prácticamente todo el mundo. Actualmente apoyamos 152 organizaciones en 39 países, ¿no? En 4 áreas principales, que es la educación, la equidad de género, libertad de violencia y explotación, que la gente se libere, las niñas, los niños, los jóvenes, de la violencia en la explotación, y el empoderamiento juvenil. Esas son nuestras 4 áreas de trabajo. Brindamos financiamiento flexible a organizaciones de base en todo el mundo, y además apoyamos en la construcción de redes y el fortalecimiento de capacidades organizacionales. El tema de masculinidades, de la promoción de masculinidades saludables, verdaderamente nos llegó por iniciativa de las organizaciones que trabajan con nosotros. En estos trabajos que hacíamos para promover el empoderamiento de niñas y jóvenes, pues muy pronto la pregunta, la devolución que nos hacían las organizaciones es, ok, ¿y qué estamos haciendo con los niños y jóvenes? Porque si no trabajamos de manera integral, estamos poniendo a las niñas en riesgo, podemos incluso potenciar algunas de las violencias de género que estamos viendo. Eso nos obligó a estar en un momento de aprendizaje, de, ok, ¿cómo podemos nosotros fortalecer al interno? ¿Cómo podemos trabajar estos temas de una manera responsable? En ese punto, Promundo ha sido y fue un gran aliado en estos primeros años. Y comenzamos, ahorita tenemos 2 iniciativas regionales muy importantes. Una en América Latina, especialmente en México, Guatemala y Honduras, y otra en el Reino Unido. Son iniciativas que agrupan, por ejemplo, en la de América Latina hay 5 organizaciones, en el Reino Unido son más. Entonces sí también nos ha obligado a hacernos esta pregunta, ¿cómo fomentamos la colaboración? No hay respuestas únicas, no hay soluciones mágicas, obviamente, pero sí te quería compartir muy brevemente algunos puntos que desde GFC hemos ido explorando, hemos ido aprendiendo y que también son seña de identidad de nosotros como organización. Uno que es muy importante y uno de los primeros que mencionaría es combatir el adultocentrismo, ser bastante autocríticos y acercarnos verdaderamente al mundo de las infancias y juventudes. Parece que lo que tenemos que hacer es enseñarles a navegar el mundo adulto o a utilizar nuestros lenguajes, cuando en realidad podemos construir espacios y proyectos e iniciativas sustentadas en el coprotagonismo, ¿no? En verdaderamente mirar, escuchar a la niñez, no solamente crear espacios separados para las niñas, los niños y los jóvenes, sino involucrarlos en procesos comunitarios más amplios. Eso es muy, muy importante, ¿no? Y lo hacemos pues desde el fomento también de estos lenguajes distintos, el arte, la música, la cultura, el hip hop. ¿Cómo podemos activar reflexiones desde estos lenguajes, ¿no? Porque muchas veces las niñas, los niños y los jóvenes dicen, cuando se trabaja este tema de la promoción, pues parece que me estás regañando todo el tiempo, parece una lección, una clase más. Entonces, ¿cómo salimos de eso y verdaderamente los miramos como agentes de cambio y protagonistas de estos procesos? ¿Cómo los vemos como multiplicadores de estos procesos y dejamos de replicar esta idea de solamente trabajamos con niños y jóvenes para prevenir violencias futuras? No, también hay que mirarlos en toda su potencialidad presente, en lo que están viviendo en esos momentos, y no solamente como trabajar esos temas como un medio para alcanzar un fin después, ¿no? Entonces, eso es muy importante. Otro segundo elemento que quería mencionar es la perspectiva interseccional. Adoptar una perspectiva interseccional es muy simplista, simplemente poner y decir el modelo de masculinidad tóxica y la masculinidad saludable. Hay mucho espectro en el medio, hay muchas maneras de vivir la masculinidad. Nosotros trabajamos con grupos indígenas también y es diferente cómo ellos lo viven, cómo a veces llegan a pensar que es una práctica colonialista, pero si se trabaja de manera participativa, poco a poco también ellos mismos se han ido dando cuenta que incluso pueden atar este trabajo de la promoción de masculinidades saludables al fortalecimiento cultural y al ver a las niñas, los niños y los jóvenes como creadores y fortalecedores de esa propia cultura, no solo como reproductores de la cultura, sino como creadores de la misma, ¿no? Entonces, el enfoque interseccional, ya lo mencionabas tú, dialogar con los movimientos feministas, con los movimientos antirracistas, con los movimientos amplios por la justicia de género, con las disidencias sexuales, es muy importante. No solamente respetar lo diverso, sino honrarlo, ¿no? Aprender a honrar la diversidad y construir indicadores que también honren esa diversidad, porque lo podemos decir como un gran discurso, pero al momento de construir indicadores, de hablar de impactos, queremos volver a meter todo en una misma bolsa, ¿no? Entonces, entender y construir indicadores también de manera interseccional, ¿no? Y otro elemento muy importante, y con esto quisiera terminar mi intervención por ahora, para no ocupar mucho tiempo, es introducir verdaderamente un enfoque comunitario. Suena un poco contradictorio, oye, ¿cómo colaboraciones regionales? Sí, estas colaboraciones regionales, este trabajo en red, tiene que partir siempre del trabajo comunitario. Nosotros en GFC vamos a las comunidades, desarrollamos las intervenciones con las organizaciones de manera participativa, tratamos de construir relaciones de confianza para que sean las mismas organizaciones las que vayan construyendo sus propios procesos. Eso es muy importante, que ellas y ellos se sientan cómodas e ir aprendiendo juntas y juntas. Y finalmente, el otro elemento de lo comunitario que rescato, Gary, es entender el trabajo de promoción de masculinidades saludables como un proyecto político, como un proyecto personal, pero orientado siempre a la transformación social, a la transformación comunitaria, a la construcción de política pública, que también se puede hacer desde una perspectiva regional. Entonces, esos 3 puntos son muy importantes, es como la base de GFC para poder generar espacios participativos, espacios en donde las organizaciones y las mismas niñeces y juventudes se sientan valorados, ¿no? Yo lo dejaría hasta ahí para no quitar más tiempo, esperando pues que haya un espacio de debate y discusión. Muchas gracias.
Thanks very much, Rodri. And I think your points on keeping the work with boys and with girls centered on an idea that children are protagonists in the process as well. They're not simply awaiting instructions from us, but in fact to engage them in genuine participatory processes that sees them as fully active throughout, I think is key. And I think your point as well of reminding us to ground the work in local context, and particularly the intersectional realities, and understand how we're not only talking about gender, but we must also talk about other historical and contextual inequalities that exist wherever we're working. And finally, I think your point of looking at children not as something that we're thinking of preventing, but looking at how we're supporting them in being and becoming. I think those are really, really important points to keep throughout. Thank you for that. Pleased to turn now to Danielle Molina with PLAN. PLAN is a partner in the Global Boyhood Initiative and has been a leader in talking about particularly the realities of girls, and your efforts globally to support girls and a feminist agenda from the early stages of childhood have really inspired a lot of important action around the world. And would love to hear some examples of how PLAN has brought boys and young men into that work, keeping your work focused on the needs of girls and of gender equality and girls and women's empowerment. How have you brought boys into that? And tell us some about that work.
Muchísimas gracias, Gary, por tu pregunta. Definitivamente el trabajo que hemos realizado desde Plan Internacional, centrado en los derechos de la niñez y la igualdad para las niñas en diferentes regiones del mundo y en más de 75 países, nos ha llevado definitivamente a reflexionar la manera en cómo podemos y debemos abordar de manera integral el trabajo también con los niños, y entre más temprano mejor, ¿no? Nuestro enfoque transformador de género que hemos definido nosotros se enfoca primero en el abordaje de las causas fundamentales de la desigualdad, pero también en reconfigurar las relaciones de poder entre las personas, ¿no? Y el cambio de las normas sociales. Para lograr esto, con los equipos de trabajo en diferentes regiones del mundo, hemos considerado como un elemento fundamental justamente poder incluir de una manera sistemática el trabajo con chicos y con jóvenes en una agenda de programación e influencia también. Que lo que podamos hacer en las comunidades que venga desde la amplificación de las voces de los chicos pueda también ser llevado en otros niveles, a nivel municipal, regional, nacional y regional, ¿no? A mí me gustaría destacar 3 razones principales de esta reflexión y la importancia que hemos visto nosotros como Plan Internacional sobre la incorporación del trabajo con chicos, ¿no? y jóvenes para el compromiso de la igualdad de género. Primero, partir de una premisa básica y fundamental. Partimos del hecho de que los derechos de las niñas son derechos humanos. Por lo tanto, desde esa premisa, los niños y los hombres en sus diferentes roles como miembros de las familias, comunidades y entornos no pueden ser ajenos a un sinnúmero de prácticas nocivas, discriminatorias y la violencia contra las niñas y las mujeres, ya que muchas veces lastimosamente son participantes directos por los mandatos de un sistema hegemónico, ¿no? y patriarcal. Partimos de ese principio, porque los derechos de las niñas son derechos humanos y los chicos tienen que también estar involucrados en este proceso. En segundo lugar, también abrir espacios de reflexión y aprendizaje con los niños les permite a ellos, por sí mismos, ver los beneficios de la igualdad de género en sus vidas. Por ejemplo, que se sientan cómodos con su propia identidad, fundamental. que tengan también la confianza de expresar emociones y sentimientos, pero también que desarrollen las herramientas necesarias para construir relaciones positivas, de confianza, de respeto, saludables con las niñas, mujeres y otras personas de su entorno. En tercer lugar, como una tercera razón, reconocemos la presión que reciben los chicos, ¿no? Por mantener, por demostrar ese molde y esos comportamientos tóxicos de la masculinidad dominante, ¿no? Y esto obviamente conduce a muchísimos riesgos y a la violencia, de nuevo, contra las niñas, contra las mujeres, contra otros niños y hombres, contra personas LGTBIQ+, y contra también ellos mismos, como por ejemplo, como todos y todas sabemos, el abuso de sustancias y alcohol, las relaciones sexuales sin protección, el abandono escolar y comportamientos y un sinnúmero de comportamientos de riesgo. Al mismo tiempo, comprendemos que aquellos chicos que no cumplen con las normas sociales impuestas, pues se enfrentan ¿a qué? A mucha resistencia en sus entornos, a mucha violencia y a la exclusión. Entonces, tener un enfoque en donde podamos desarrollar, reflexionar, pero también desarrollar acciones concretas con ellos y desde ellos mismos sobre cómo estos mandatos impuestos por las normas de género tienen consecuencias negativas para ellos, pero también para otras personas en su entorno. Pero al mismo tiempo, reflexionar y comprender cómo la igualdad de género puede tener un valor y tiene un valor positivo en sus propias vidas. Entonces, esas tres son elementos fundamentales, razones fundamentales que hemos ido reflexionando como organización, pero también desde la práctica programática tenemos una gran posibilidad como plan internacional de tener acciones en comunidad que nos ayudan a involucrarnos directamente con las comunidades y con las fuerzas vivas. La práctica comunitaria que nos ha enseñado, primero, que el abordaje con los chicos es un proceso efectivo, porque los chicos pueden ser más receptivos al cambio de comportamientos, actitudes y prácticas, y también a esa oportunidad de ver las relaciones de género desde una forma diferente, en sus hogares, en sus escuelas y en comunidades. Por ejemplo, hemos desarrollado el modelo de campeonas y campeones del cambio, que involucra a adolescentes desde 12 años hasta los 17 en un proceso de reflexión con enfoques sincronizados. Esto nos ha ayudado muchísimo también a poder trabajar con los chicos y abrir estos espacios de reflexión. Los chicos también crecen promoviendo el respeto y cuestionando las normas de género abusivas y perjudiciales en su entorno. Y logran también ser multiplicadores y inspirar a otros a hacer lo mismo. Por ejemplo, en temas como derechos sexuales y derechos reproductivos, en temas de consentimiento pleno, en masculinidades positivas, en la prevención de violencia. Esos elementos de cuestionamiento a esas normas sociales y qué es lo que impulsa a los chicos es sumamente rico entre ellos y obviamente crear diálogos intergeneracionales, pero también con las chicas y con las mujeres. Y luego la tercera gran aprendizaje también de la práctica programática es que juntos, tanto niñas como niños, desde un enfoque sincronizado, multiplican su poder como agentes de cambio en sus entornos de trabajo. Entonces, esta experiencia, Gary, nos ha ayudado también a nosotros a ver el involucramiento de los niños para que desarrollen masculinidades positivas y diversas, y nos ha ayudado a verlo como uno de los 6 elementos fundamentales de nuestro enfoque transformador de género, ¿no? Que a la par de elementos tan importantes como fortalecer la agencia de las niñas, el reconocimiento de los niños y niñas en toda su diversidad, Rodrigo lo decía, no verlos en una sola bolsa, ¿no? Es ver a los niños y niñas en toda su diversidad, la construcción de espacios propicios para la igualdad de género, el trabajo sistemático del cambio en la condición y posición de las niñas, todos esos elementos y el trabajo en masculinidades positivas y diversas desde temprana edad son elementos fundamentales para el plan internacional para poder impulsar procesos de transformación de género, tanto en sectores de desarrollo como humanitarios. Creemos que si reforzamos estas oportunidades, abrimos estas oportunidades desde temprana edad, los chicos desde pequeños entonces van creciendo y desarrollando esas habilidades de poder practicar la solidaridad, la empatía y la conexión sana y respetuosa con las personas, ¿no? Y que no definan su vida no solamente por la competencia, la violencia y las normas nocivas de género. Yo me quedaría ahí, Gary, y de regreso contigo.
Thanks, Danielle. I think the lessons of how to get this right at the community level, how to keep the focus on girls' empowerment and gender equality with a children's rights perspective. Plan has been a global reference for that, and thank you for sharing that. And I think an understanding as well of the how challenging and restrictive the mandates of masculinity are in many settings, and the importance to work with boys to see their own benefits in breaking out of those, but also keeping it centered in a full respect and support for women's and girls' rights. So thank you for sharing that. The reach of Plan to influence in so many spaces from community to policy level has been key in this topic, and your work has certainly inspired where the Global Boyhood Initiative is coming from and where we hope it goes. So thank you for that. I'll turn now to Tatiana Moura with Promundo in Portugal. And Tatiana, Promundo in Portugal has led several multi-country projects in Europe looking at how to engage healthy masculinities with young men, but also engaging young women in conversations around gender equality, taking those into schools, trying to take those into public institutions. And you have a new initiative now called Kinder that is trying to do this at younger ages and with the educational sector. Tell us about that work and how that process has gone.
Thank you, Gary, and thank you for the invitation. It's great to be on this panel and to learn so much with our partners from the Global Boyhood Initiative. Well, let me say that everything that I've been doing and we've been doing here results from more than 10 years of learning in the Southern Hemisphere, namely in Brazil and in Latin America. So 4 years ago, we started what we call the adaptation of programs H&M at European level in 5 countries. And of course, H&M targeted youth starting at the age of 12. And we understood that both from the Promundo side and from the research that we've been carrying in Europe, that it was too late. And so luckily, the Kinder program and the Global Boyhood Initiative started almost simultaneously, and we managed to partner. And so from recent research, we saw that at the age of 5, boys have stronger gendered attitudes than girls, for example, if we look at the OECD study survey. And this means that they have stronger attitudes and gendered attitudes regarding professions, regarding toys, regarding their activities. Also, at European level, there is still a strong focus in terms of research and in terms of program approach on the need to work with teenagers. So again, starting at the age of 12. And we know that it is too late once again. And there's a lack of investments in promoting gender inclusive and transformative methodologies and approaches targeting younger ages. And so this means, and as a consequence, that there is an absence or a need for gender training for education professionals. And when we talk about education and these kind of professionals, we're not talking only about teachers, but educations from the school system. And this means that these professionals usually don't question gender bias and stereotypes in many cases. And in the education system. This means the physical space, for example, the toys they use, the colors they use, the ways they organize the playground, but also their individual attitudes. And this doesn't mean that they do this in a conscious way, but sometimes the individual attitudes, of course, they have as a result the perpetuation of gender stereotypes and promoting them in the school environments. So given all this background, we started Kinder, and Kinder is a program, a project, and it's not only in Portugal, it's Portugal, carried out and is led by the Center for Social Studies at University of Coimbra, where Promundo Portugal is hosted, but also our colleagues in Spain, the CEPAIM Foundation, and our colleagues in Croatia with Status Sem. So they were like old friends of Promundo and partners. The point of departure is that I believe we've been doing a good work with girls, telling girls that they can be whatever they want, that they can be successful. But I think we've been less effective with boys, promoting caring practices, telling them that they can express their feelings, etc. Again, we keep putting the burden of gender equality on the hands of girls that will be future women and part of the feminist movement. But we need to target boys. So the rationale behind Kinder is quite the same of the Global Boyhood Initiative. And this consortium already worked together with the Equiex project, and now we're targeting professionals and institutions working with children from the age of 3 up to the age of 12 years old. We're not doing gender transformative methodology that targets directly children, but we are working with professionals because we think we need to start by working with the institution and the professionals so that they can change their daily practices. What is our strategy? First of all, in the 3 countries, we partnered with government institutions and with the governments. We're targeting universities, so training and developing curricula in order to train university students that will become teachers. And in the end, we want to develop gender transformative curricula and a set of good practices, what we've been calling the playroom, where you can find methodologies and workshops and short films and tools and methodologies that professionals can use in their daily work. Because in European countries, and at least in these 3 countries, you don't have a systematic approach to promote gender equality on their daily work and targeting this age group. So I think that partnering with the Global Boyhood Initiative, and it's an honor to be part of this global initiative, will give us some ideas and some inspiration in terms of developing campaigns, and specifically in what concerns media messages. That is something that is not included in our Kinder project, and we want to include. So I think that it's, for now, that's enough. We can keep the conversation going during the debate, but just a last note to mention the importance of engaging families. And I think I saw some comments in the chat of engaging families on this work, because we can transform the school system, we can transform the institutions, but then again, children go home and they unlearn or hear different messages. So the idea of doing this together with families is very important. So we will also engage families, and we will use lessons learned from previous projects that we developed in Brazil, Latin America, like Program P, focusing on fatherhood and caregiving, but also at European level with our parent project. So I think this is a good combination of what we've been learning for the last almost 25 years. Thank you.
Thanks, Tatiana. And I think the importance of how much it matters to look at the education system at all levels, that is teacher training, what teachers do, but also the school environment, the physical space, the gender project, to call it that, overall, that happens in the education system. And I think understanding how to do that's not as simple as here's a curriculum, here's teacher training, and we're done, I think is really important to talk about. And as the world emerges from COVID lockdowns and children are back, and in many countries already are back physically in school again, the importance of the school environment. And I think you're joining us to say, while we've done a still unfinished project of empowering girls, achieving gender equality can't be only on the backs of women and girls. The importance of how we start early with boys around that topic. So thank you for bringing that up. Finally, for this round, I'm thrilled to introduce Anthony Keaty, who works with Abad in Lebanon and also regionally in the Middle East. And Anthony, the question to you, we've had the chance to partner on some research together and seen just the challenges of how alive and well certain harmful ideas of masculinities are in parts of the Middle East. Not only, I could say the same about the US and Brazil and lots of other places in the world, but you've seen some very particular ways that rigid, restrictive, misogynist views about masculinity have maybe even made a resurgence in some cases. Tell us about what you've learned in the work to engage young men as allies in that, and your thoughts on how in the setting of the Middle East, which in addition to that has a huge a legacy and ongoing conflict, and certainly in Lebanon, where you have one of the largest refugee populations in the world. How do you bring this issue in such a complex setting? I know that's a big question.
Right, but I'm thank you so much for having me, and I'm used to us asking big questions to one another and trying to see how to tackle them. So as Gary pointed out, a few years ago, Promundo was able to partner with several different people to conduct the first wide-scale quantitative analysis or study on masculinities in the MENA region, which was mainly in Egypt, Morocco, Palestine, and in Lebanon. And we talk about this Boyhood Initiative and the necessity of focusing on young men. The imager study in the MENA region, looking at all 4 countries, was one of the only imager studies that contradicted findings that were found all over the world when it comes to images, that younger men were more likely to have gender inequitable attitudes than older men, where usually the opposite would be found in different imager studies. And that really causes a lot of worry when we're talking about what is happening with young men and how can we better engage them? What sort of a future is in store for young men and women unless we address this immediately. And I know so much of our work is focused on understanding enabling environments. And then you stop and think, what kind of environment, what is being enabled in the environments that exist around the MENA region and in these countries that we look at. And we see militarism, and we see war, we see violence, we see conflict, we see abuse, we see systems that blatantly discriminate against women and girls legally, socially, politically. And then we need to stop and ask ourselves if this is really that surprising that young men growing up in these environments come out to be this patriarchal or to hold these discriminative, misogynist or patriarchal attitudes and behaviors. And what can we do? If we just talk about Lebanon, we see, who do these men look up to? Aside from the patriarchal images of media and iterations of patriarchal masculinity in the media that I know we'll talk more about later, they look at the politicians. These are military leaders and violent militia group leaders that existed during the Civil War, sectarian leaders that existed during the Civil War, that then took on leadership positions within our government to this day, that have had impunity, unrelinquished impunity for anything that they've done. And then again, asking ourselves, if young men are looking to successful models of what it means to be a man, and they see that it's violence and power and corruption and considering oneself before the well-being of the collective and impunity towards any violence or discrimination against other people, what can we really expect? And you see that in the young men's faces when we want to talk about what we do. Let's just say, even thinking about different intersectionalities that exist, refugee populations, young men living in Lebanon below standards of poverty, who have known nothing but war since the Syrian crisis that started a decade ago, that only know discrimination, only know violence, only know war, don't even have the opportunities to be educated or to find themselves out of it. They find themselves burdened with hyper-masculine or patriarchal masculine ideals of providing for the family in their childhood, in their innocence, in their ages of innocence. And you see that. You see them wearing this armor of emotionlessness. You see the performance of this patriarchal militant masculinity when they come into the rooms for the programs that we have, when they enter into debates, when we hand out our messages. You see that on their face. It's hardened. They are attempting to keep people beyond arm's length, because that's what they've learned a real man does in order to succeed in this power over system. And that's where these programs come in. That's where we try to create the safe space. We try to ask the questions that need to be asked. And slowly you see these young men and women bring down that armor, bring down their guards, and have real discussions about what gender means in their lives and how it's impacting their lives and the lives of other people. We work, again, the importance of working with family. So much of our work with Promundo has focused around working with young men in Barnamij Ra, and even a new model we have for including comprehensive sexual education into that with partners Rutgers and Prevention Plus. But also fatherhood, and how do we cut off the generational transmission of these patriarchal values and these patriarchal models of masculinity by working with fathers before it's too late. So really bringing in this element of how do we make prevention the core focus of our work, and focusing on young men and boys, and then not stopping there, but really moving towards policy and advocacy, both in terms of how do we engage communities, how do we bring these programs to become more systemic within our culture, but also in how do we connect these with the lives of women and girls more directly? How do we, and I'm loving how much focus here is on allyship and the focus. So how do we do advocacy with allies? How do we focus on allyship within advocacy and have men and boys become individuals who are standing side by side with women, girls, and people of all orientations and identities to fight for human rights of all, to lend their voices and support to changes in our country that can happen on a systemic level and for the region.
Thanks, Anthony. And I think the importance of acknowledging how any project, any initiative, any attempt to build into systems, schools, households of healthy masculinity with boys has to consider the political context and the historical context, and in the Middle East and Lebanon specifically, just how much that does mean understanding, building accountable systems that respond, and also globally, how do we respond to the ongoing conflict and crisis and its aftermath. And I think you're situating just how long that work will take, that it's not a one-off. Thank you for sharing that. And I think at the multiple levels that you discuss as well, that yes, we need to get well-designed programs built in and institutionalized in public institutions, but we've also got to think about the advocacy work that has to take place to go with that, to build responsive and accountable states that include gender justice as part of what they're trying to do. So thank you for that. I'm looking at time now, and there's been a couple of great questions that what I'm going to propose is, given time, that we take those questions into the breakout rooms. And Alexa, if you can put the next slide on, we'll talk about what we're going to do in the four breakout rooms. Tatiana will lead the one looking at how do we keep this work centered in a feminist approach. So that is breakout group 1. Group number 2 will be led by Anthony around an intersectional approach. How do we talk about the needs of boys of different ethnic and racial minorities? How do we talk about boys who are other than heterosexual? How do we talk about boys across gender identities, boys living in specific situations of refugee status and of poverty? The third one, we will have Rodrigo, and also he will be joined by Catherine Gilmore, also from the Global Fund for Children, talking about how to make this work culturally relevant, and discussing that is, how do we look at the specificities of a given cultural setting? And then Danielle in the main room will be talking about partnership. What are strategic ways that we can partner to achieve this idea of gender justice and gender equality from the youngest ages and involving boys? And I'd suggest just that take into the groups, and maybe I can assign them to groups. There was one question about parents and how to work with parents. That this is obviously not just about boys as individuals, but boys within their family setting. I would suggest maybe parents as partners in this. And so suggest that question, Danielle, if you could take that up in your group. And there was a question about what happens after our discussions about healthy masculinities with boys, whether in the school setting or otherwise, and they then go back to a world that pushes back on a progressive feminist view of the world. And Tatiana, I'd like to suggest that your group take on that question as well. Third, there was a question around, how do we get boys to discuss healthy masculinities and young men to discuss healthy masculinities when they're concerned about basic things like jobs and employment and income for their households? And Anthony, I'd like to suggest that your group take on that question as well. And there was a question around other spaces that we need to do this work. One person asked about work with religious groups and religious leaders. And I think that is an important topic that we have not brought up yet. And I'm going to suggest that Rodrigo and Catherine include that topic in their group. So with that, let us take, I'm looking at time, let us take 25 minutes in group, and we'll need to come back sharply at 10:25. So we've got time for the discussion about engaging the media, and then we'll close. So if we will pull up the groups, you can click onto the group that you're interested in participating in, and then we will come back at 25 after. Danielle, over to you. I think those of us staying in the main room to talk about partnerships.
Muchísimas gracias, Gary. Yo creo que ya tenemos acá a 32 personas, creo, ¿no?
Daniel,
O
there
nos
is
mantenemos en
interpretation
español.
in this room, so you can speak Spanish and then people can select which room they
Okay, perfect.
would like
Thank you
to
very much.
hear in.
Súper. Entonces, bueno, iniciamos. Muchísimas gracias, bienvenidas y bienvenidos a este grupo de trabajo. La idea es poder tener una reflexión.
Sí.
La idea es poder tener un espacio de trabajo para poder una máxima colaboración y participación para el trabajo con chicos, ¿no? Me gustaría iniciar entonces con la pregunta que Gary nos invitó a hacer, que es justamente viendo a los padres como socios, ¿no? ¿Cómo deberíamos nosotros entonces ver a los padres como socios y cuáles serían los elementos para poder empezar a trabajar con los padres desde una perspectiva de colaboración? Vamos a ver si a alguien le gustaría compartir algo.
Have we lost Danielle, or others able to hear?
No, I think we've lost him.
Okay.
Aquí estoy de nuevo.
Okay.
Ok. Hablábamos sobre la importancia, ¿no?, de ver a los padres como socios. Dominique nos decía de poder crear modelos de trabajo con padres. ¿Qué otra idea podemos tener? Muchas gracias, Dominique. Un programa en Europa que crea espacios de aprendizaje en línea, plataformas de aprendizaje en línea para poder incentivar la educación con los padres, y trabaja muy bien. Ok, muchísimas gracias, Dominique. Hugo también nos comparte: la transformación de las paternidades pasa por involucrar a esos padres en actividades lúdicas con sus hijos e hijas. Totalmente cierto, Hugo. Muchísimas gracias. Debemos de incentivar esos espacios de reflexión y de diálogo intergeneracional, ¿verdad? Para que los padres, para que los cuidadores también se vean como socios en este proceso. Excelente, muy bien. Ahora, me gustaría compartir también algunas otras preguntas que puedan incentivar la discusión. Digamos, por ejemplo, desde sus experiencias en el trabajo de involucrar a socios clave, ¿no? Por ejemplo, en el trabajo con los chicos. ¿Cómo deberíamos de pensar estratégicamente en los socios? ¿Cuáles serían esos principios básicos para trabajar? Creo que Gary lo mencionaba, ¿no? Lo mencionaba al inicio del webinario. Es importante saber de que no estamos solos como organizaciones, ¿no? Pues no, como una organización nada más no podemos hacer frente a todos los elementos o abordar todas las problemáticas. Cuando se trata de trabajar con niños, con una mirada en el avance de la igualdad de género a largo plazo, ¿cómo y por qué deberíamos de pensar estratégicamente en nuestros socios? Dice la actriz, enfoques generacionales, 2 enfoques generacionales ayudan. Están empezando un proyecto en Atlanta que también trabaja con padres y con hijos. Muy bien, excelente. Excelente la actriz. ¿Qué deberían ser los principios clave? ¿Cómo podemos nosotros identificar a los socios clave? ¿Cuáles serían esos principios? Por ejemplo, Latriz, cuéntanos cuando están iniciando este proyecto en Atlanta, ¿cómo han visto, a quiénes han visto como sus socios clave para poder incentivar la colaboración? Estos socios pueden venir de sociedad civil, pueden venir también de entidades estatales o de gobierno, pueden venir de los grupos feministas. ¿Qué opinan sobre eso? Están en el chat también, abierto el chat para poder compartir, si gustan. Excelente. Latriz nos comparte, debemos de trabajar estratégicamente porque las familias y los niños y los jóvenes están involucrados en múltiples programas y sistemas, ¿no? Así que la filantropía, lo social, los servicios, la salud, la academia, etcétera, deben de estar involucrados. Ese es un excelente punto, Latriz. Muchas veces, si nosotros, como principio básico, si debemos de hacer ese mapeo, ¿no? De socios y de colaboración para maximizar esa participación. Y en toda la medida posible, tratar de evitar la duplicidad de acciones, ¿no? Como, por ejemplo, desde el sector filantrópico, desde el sector social de sociedad civil, desde las comunidades mismas, desde los proveedores de servicios, la academia, podemos coordinar de manera estratégica para que los programas sean más robustos. Creo que eso es sumamente clave. Y poder también hacerle frente a una realidad que está presente, ¿no? Que es la escasez de los recursos que muchas veces el trabajo con niños tiene, ¿no? Hugo, gracias Hugo. Los socios clave están en la misma comunidad. Llegar a los hombres y motivar lo que hacen bien. No enfocar en la crítica de lo que dejan de hacer, sino que en lo que hacen bien. Hugo, esto es sumamente importante y desde Plan, nosotros que trabajamos en base comunitaria y en diferentes niveles, eso es clave, lo que tú mencionas, ¿no? Llegar a los hombres para poder motivar lo que hacen bien, verlos como aliados de ese proceso, ¿no? ¿Cuáles son estos hombres, padres o cuidadores que te pueden ayudar a incentivar a otros, ¿no? A ser esos catalizadores de otros hombres para poder involucrarlos en un proceso, ¿no? Creo que eso es excelente, ver a las comunidades y particularmente a los hombres como socios clave para motivarlos, ¿no? Excelente. Y luego motivarlos para este sentido de hacer los diálogos intergeneracionales con los chicos, ¿no? Eso es clave, ¿no? Yo creo que también, y tener en cuenta mucho el contexto, ¿no? El contexto en donde trabajamos, por ejemplo, Latinoamérica tiene un contexto bien particular, y luego si haces un enfoque mucho más, puedes ver un contexto mucho más particular si te vas a Centroamérica, por ejemplo, o si te vas a la parte andina. El identificar socios, por ejemplo, que tengan la posibilidad de conectarte interculturalmente, en diferentes regiones es sumamente importante, ¿no? Y trabajar desde donde estamos. Muy bien, excelente. Y creo que también el punto que Latriz mencionaba sobre la realidad es que los chicos no viven en una burbuja o en un silo, ¿no? Sino que también tienen en sus entornos diversas acciones y se interconectan con diferentes programas, acciones, escuela, comunidad, en donde debemos de responsablemente ver cómo debemos de colaborar de manera estratégica y organizada. Muy bien. No sé si pues la siguiente pregunta también podría ser interesante. Si tienen algún ejemplo de su propia experiencia técnica o que hayan visto en donde la colaboración y la participación de socios clave se haya hecho especialmente bien. O sea, un ejemplo o una experiencia que ustedes han visto esto debido a la acción y colaboración entre los socios clave salió especialmente bien. No sé si tienen algún ejemplo sobre esas prácticas de colaboración en el trabajo con chicos que podamos compartir. Si me permiten, yo podría... Ahí está. Ok. Dice Hugo, estamos trabajando con papás de niños y niñas migrantes en frontera norte y sur de México que no sé por estar tratando de encontrar salidas para sus vidas. La experiencia es con UNICEF. Excelente. Esto es muy bueno. Gracias, Hugo. Es interesante cómo también el trabajo con chicos, el trabajo con padres, entra específica y particularmente en temáticas de desarrollo y humanitarias. La realidad migrante, pues del Triángulo Norte de Centroamérica, de los países de Honduras, Guatemala y El Salvador, es una realidad abismal y qué bien que están trabajando sobre este tema, ¿no? Con UNICEF, perfecto. Contarte también, Hugo, de que hay una posibilidad, pues Plan también trabaja en las zonas fronterizas con Guatemala y México y puede haber una conexión ahí también. Gracias, Hugo. Bianca dice, they are unable, ok, listo. Excelente, gracias Bianca por el heads up. Creo que el trabajo con socios en temas específicos, como lo menciona Hugo, es sumamente importante y qué bien que están desarrollando también esa experiencia de cómo trabajar con padres y con niños y niñas migrantes en las fronteras. Eso es muy bueno. Y están incluyendo el tema de masculinidades, que muchas veces pues no se incluye de la manera en que debería de incluirse, ¿no? Súper. ¿Algún otro ejemplo que pueden compartir en el chat? Dominique, en Bélgica tenemos un sistema para poder trabajar en asocios con profesionales que están alrededor de los niños. Pero muchas veces el gobierno no se involucra en procesos y es muy malo, ¿no? Es un pesar. Definitivamente, Dominique, creo que muchas veces la carga queda solo en sociedad civil, en organizaciones, con profesionales y muchas veces el asocio con los gobiernos o con los responsables o garantes, ¿no?, de derechos de los estados, llega a niveles de la provisión de servicios, ¿no? Sin embargo, cuando queremos desarrollar una estrategia, muchas veces los gobiernos no están ahí, no se comprometen en diferentes niveles y en espacios de toma de decisión, lo que te imposibilita eso, ¿no? Excelente. Así que creo que eso es clave, ver cómo poder desarrollar estrategias para poder involucrar a los gobiernos en diferentes niveles, ¿no? En esos profesionales de gobierno que trabajan con nosotros y nosotras en las comunidades, pero también ir a otros niveles para poder conseguir un apoyo político que es fundamental, ¿no? Creo que que nos comparte Dominique es sumamente importante, ¿no? Muchas gracias. A ver, ¿tendrían algún consejo o alguna específico desde su región? ¿Alguna lección aprendida desde su región o desde su propio país y contexto? Ese consejo específico que venga desde su experiencia, que nos ayude a asegurar la colaboración y participación de socios clave. ¿Cuál sería su consejo? ¿Cuál podría ser ese consejo clave que debemos de tener en cuanto a los socios? A ver si alguien se anima por el chat, ese consejo que ayuda o les ha ayudado a ustedes desde sus países, desde sus contextos, a poder realmente asegurar la colaboración de socios clave en el proceso. ¿Cuál sería ese tip? ¿Cuál sería ese consejo desde su experiencia? Gracias, Hugo. Hugo nos dice, los socios podrían enfocarse más en cambios de calidad y no tanto en números. Muy bien, eso nos lleva también a poder identificar las fortalezas de cómo monitoreamos y evaluamos los cambios en actitudes, comportamientos y prácticas más allá de la contabilización de las personas que participan en los procesos. Muchas gracias, Hugo. Beatriz nos dice, ser transparente, trabajar juntos y juntas para identificar una visión en común. Desarrollo y construcción de la confianza mediante la muestra de esos beneficios mutuos sobre el paternariado. Creo que esto es súper clave, Beatriz. Muchísimas gracias. Ser transparente y trabajar juntos y identificar esa visión común. Y eso indica también la necesidad, Beatriz, de poder poner en la mesa del partnership, en la mesa de discusión, qué es lo que nosotros, cada una de las organizaciones trae como un valor añadido, ¿no? Eso creo que es sumamente clave. ¿Qué traemos nosotros? Pero que también andamos buscando como complemento con los socios, ¿no? Eso es sumamente importante. Dice Oscar, hola, buen día. Yo trabajo en la asociación que se llama y hemos tratado de hacer enlaces con el gobierno. Nos desarrollamos en la Sierra de Chihuahua el año pasado. Logramos hacer un enlace con el gobierno del estado mediante el DIF, área encargada de trabajar con niñez, familia y mujeres. Nuestro trabajo se desarrolló con jóvenes, pero el gobierno se enfoca más a la calidad, a la cantidad de informes que podemos entregar que con la enseñanza significativa. Definitivamente, Oscar, esa es una realidad que permea mucho trabajo con el Estado en Latinoamérica. Podría verse reflejado en cualquier país de Latinoamérica y es la importancia más en la cantidad de reportes y en la cantidad de conteos que en realidad en identificar y monitorear los cambios de comportamiento en los chicos, los cambios en las actitudes y en las prácticas de los chicos, ¿no? Hay ciertos tips, por ejemplo, desde la experiencia de plan que podemos abordar, es desarrollar herramientas prácticas que ayuden a poder traer a los asocios y la colaboración a poder ver no solo la importancia de medir los cambios en comportamientos y actitudes, pero también poner a disposición herramientas que puedan ayudar a poder medir esos cambios. Por ejemplo, desde Plan nosotros hemos desarrollado una herramienta que trabaja como un marcador, así le llamamos, el marcador transformador de género. Y el marcador transformador de género te mide los proyectos y cómo esos proyectos y cómo el asocio va trabajando, cómo vamos trabajando en asocio para poder asegurar que nuestra implementación tenga conciencia de género, pero también sea transformadora de género. Pero no solamente lo mide, sino que te hace y te ayuda a hacer la reflexión sobre qué necesitas tú y los socios, como un consorcio, trabajar para poder asegurar cambios reales y de calidad. Entonces, proporcionar herramientas concretas, no complejas, aunque sabemos que las temáticas de desarrollo y humanitaria son complejas, pero poder desarrollar herramientas que sean concretas y de contexto específicas para poder desarrollar y poder asegurar la medición de calidad. Vamos a ver qué más dice Dominique. Dice, this kind of meeting is important and we should... Exactamente, eso es muy importante, poder tener este tipo de pláticas y poder también trabajar con otros profesionales. Santiago, Oscar Santiago dice, y como comentabas, el real trabajo recae en las asociaciones y no en el apoyo con el gobierno. En lo personal hemos tenido malas experiencias en la búsqueda de socios para el desarrollo de estos temas. Sí, definitivamente no es tan sencillo. Sin embargo, por eso es tan importante poder poner, como decimos, cabeza, corazón y alma al tema de los asocios. Primero, por el principio de que no podemos hacerlo solos y solas. Segundo, también por lo que nos comentaban anteriormente, los recursos son escasos. Debemos de encontrar colaboración para poder asegurar cambios a largo plazo, ¿no? Y sostenibilidad, por un lado, sí, pero también el trabajo coordinado con los socios, desde mi punto de vista, y desde la experiencia de Plan Internacional nos ayuda también a ampliar escala de un proyecto, ¿no? Muchas veces los proyectos enfocados con chicos se quedan en modelos comunitarios muy exitosos, muy buenos, muy efectivos en un contexto dado, en una comunidad, en un espacio o en un contexto. Sin embargo, cuando los desarrollamos con asocios, los asocios pueden ser la clave para poder asegurar la ampliación de escala. Vamos a más allá de la sostenibilidad y la ampliación de escala al lograr poder expander, ¿verdad? nuestro alcance, ¿no? Como socios y como organizaciones. Entonces eso es muy importante. Creo que, bueno, quedamos aquí con estos comentarios. Muchísimas gracias y gracias por todas sus ideas en el chat. Son muy valiosas y pues nos vemos en el...
Hi all, sorry, did we jumped back into the main group, I suppose? Yes. Soon, I thought we had a couple of more minutes there. Thanks everybody I had the chance to jump around just a bit to a few of the groups. It would be impossible to try to sum up, but I just wanted to say thanks as well for dealing with this challenge of small groups are not quite the same on Zoom as they are in real life. But thank you for jumping into them and offering some useful and important reflections. I'll just maybe give a couple of thoughts that I kind of heard on the fly going through a number of the groups. We heard a lot about the importance of mentorship, some interesting examples of parent and two-generational programs that I think we certainly want to continue to share experiences as part of the Global Boyhood Initiative. There was a lot of discussion of the linkage between just how kind of from earliest ages and even during pregnancy and gestation that so much of gender is constructed from son preference onward, and how an understanding of that has been an aha moment or a driver for so many of us who do this work as activists. And I think to keep in mind the personal is political, and to understand that how these norms and power dynamics play out from earliest childhood are so constitutive of gender inequality. Heard a lot about local ownership and the importance of local voices of resistance of men and boys and women and girls who own this work and take it ahead, not coming from outside, but really being locally owned. Heard about the importance of good facilitation, that the details of how we get that right are really, really key. And heard as well in a couple of the sessions, we can't just assume this is some simplistic, let's raise healthy boys and we're done with it. That the power structures, the context, situations of poverty, of historical exclusion are so woven into this as well. That does not begin to get at the complexity of the issues you all brought up. But in the interest of time, I just wanted to share with you some of the topics that I quickly took away. I'm looking at our time. We're at about 30 past. We've got about 20 to 20 minutes or so left. Thank you for staying with us until now. I'm pleased now to turn over to another realm of how we make gender and how we can unmake the harmful aspects of it and the power imbalances behind it, which is thinking about the media. And Madeline has been a former Promundo board member, and the Gina Davis Institute has been a partner of ours for many years. We've long admired and cheered from the sidelines of how they have questioned power dynamics at the roots in terms of how some of the most seen aspects of media are made in Hollywood and beyond. We've been inspired by the way that they use a gender analysis to dissect what it is that we watch on media and how much that shapes who we are. And so we reached out to say we'd love to do an understanding of what boys are watching on television. And maybe, Madeline, you can talk as well about the new video game study as well, just to hint at it, to say, how do we engage, not just to do the research for research's sake, but how do we take this research to really try to reshape what it is that boys and men are watching in terms of harmful masculinity. So with that, turn it over to Madeline to share with us the results of the study on what boys are watching on television.
Hi, everyone. And Alexa, I'm going to have you move forward to the next slide. Great. So I just want to frame this for everyone. And thank you so much, Gary. And it's just been such a privilege to be a part of Promundo. And it's been a dream for us in the Institute to be able to look at how is media, what is the role that media is playing in all of this. And I'm sure many of you know, but the consumption of media, whether it's small screen, big screen, on a device, is at an all-time high. I could speak for children in the United States are engaging with media upwards of 7 hours a day. It's most of their waking time, and that doesn't even include homework. And of course, given COVID, streaming has gone up, 68%. So when you think about what are the factors that influence your child, the family, of course, at the heart, education, church, religion, but also media. So this study that we did was built on the previous research of Promundo and previous studies. And there's a few components on it. So one, it does incorporate the man box, some of the factors from the man box. And then we go into what are we seeing in the media? And then we also have some surveys. So the purpose of this report was to really examine the messages about masculinity that is revealed in popular television for boys 7 to 13. So that is the target audience. And most of the existing research on gender representation in kids' TV has been really focused on girls and women because they have been the most underserved. And I did want to thank again, this is a collaboration between Promundo, the Caring Foundation generously, funded this study. And let's jump in now. So with regard to the man box study, and I would invite, Gary to jump in if he would like, in terms of the survey, to what extent do rigid expectations about how men should behave affect young men? And that was based on a survey of nearly 4,000 young men ages 18 to 30 in the US, in the UK, and Mexico. So let's move forward. And again, there are 7 key pillars for the man box study. When we talk about self-sufficiency, we're talking about men are expected to be entirely self-reliant. They should figure it out for themselves. When we look at acting tough, a man must defend his reputation, be willing to use physical aggression to do so, always be strong. Physical attraction. A man should always be physically attractive, but effortlessly so. A man who spends too much time worrying about his looks is not masculine. Rigid masculine gender roles. Men should engage in stereotypically masculine activities and embrace stereotypical masculine roles. With regard to heterosexuality and homophobia, being gay or queer is not manly, and men should avoid being gay or perceived as being gay. Hypersexuality, men should value sexual conquests over intimacy. And lastly, aggression and control, men should be willing to use violence to get respect and should have the final say. So those are just some of the key pillars. Let's move on. So men in the man box in Mexico are 3 times more likely than their peers outside the man box to report having perpetrated sexual harassment. And in the UK, 6 times more likely. And in the US, 6 times more likely. Let's move on. Also, they are much more likely when it comes to risky and violent behavior, drink to the point of getting drunk, online bullying within the last month, being in traffic accidents, and having perpetrated physical bullying in the last month. Let's move on. The cost. This is costing us a fortune. These harmful ideas about manhood are attributing to an estimated $15.7 billion a year in the US for men ages 18 to 30. Let's move on. So for the media, again, what happens in the fictional world more often than not plays out in the real world. So the primary question was, to what extent does boys' media reinforce this man box? And so this was an analysis of the top 25 Nielsen rated TV shows of 2018 for boys 7 to 13. And it was over 3,000 characters from nearly 450 episodes. And this was a combination of two technologies that we have, the GDIQ, which is the Gina Davis Inclusion Quotient, and also expert human codings. Let's move forward. So what did we find? Well, first of all, reinforces rigid gender roles, which is one of the key pillars of the man box. Male characters are more likely to be shown as having a job. They are less likely to be shown engaging in hands-on parenting, and they are less likely to be shown as being competent parents. In many cases, in a lot of US television, you see kind of the bumbling father who cannot be left with their child alone. Let's move on. Another reinforcement of the man box. Boys are more likely to be shown without parents, without any parents. Girls are more likely to be shown in close relationships with their mothers. Male characters are more likely to be shown engaging in risky behaviors, which again is one of the pillars of the man box. Let's move on. In terms of aggression, which again is another pillar of the man box, male characters are more likely to be shown committing violent acts against another. Conflict resolution, we're not showing that there can be peaceful conflict resolution, it's resulting in violence. And male characters of color are less likely to be shown expressing emotion over than angry. So that plays and harkens back to this angry Black person. There's always this angry Black woman trope and stereotype. Let's move on. In terms of positive female representation, we have found that when it comes to who is showing up and how often they're seen, that female characters in the fictional world are at a parity with their male lead counterparts, and they are speaking and on screen with equal amounts. And female characters are more likely to be shown in positions of leadership. Let's move on. In terms of media consumption during COVID, and again, particularly with Gen Z, 16 to 23 years old, Gen Z is, from other studies, the most stressed out of all of our generational, populations. In terms of media consumption with COVID, let's move on. I mean, these numbers have all catapulted when we released this study, and now the numbers have all really, shot up across the board, all in the high, 60s. Let's move on. So then, as we mentioned, there was also a survey of parents. And the primary question we wanted to ask is, what do parents in the US want for their sons, for their boys, when it comes to these gender norms and masculinity? And so this was a national survey of parents of boys ages 4 to 14 in the US. And it was focus groups with boys ages 8 to 16 in California and in Pennsylvania. Let's move forward. So the parents. So what is most important for their sons to learn? 61% to be honest, 56% respect others, 53% be responsible, 44% be hardworking, and 35% be emotionally healthy. Let's move on. In terms of, what are the pressures? There's so much pressures on our children. And how much pressure, if any, do you think the boys will feel? This is what we tried to get at with the parents. And you can see in terms of the pressure to be physically strong, a lot, 24%, some 38%. I mean, most of these are all in the 20s, almost equally distributed in terms of sports, fitting in, being emotionally strong, acting like a boy and not a girl. There's about a quarter of the respondents said a lot. Let's move forward. And then the pressure on the parents, or the pressure that our parents and parents are feeling, especially in our COVID world, having to not only work, but also supervise your children's education, particularly for younger children who aren't able to be independent. This question we asked is, do you think boys in our society feel comfortable talking about their emotions when they feel? And again, overwhelmingly, you can see no, particularly when it comes to being insecure or weak, embarrassed, lonely, scared, sad. And particularly, I think the other thing we all realize with COVID is that, suicide rates, have also catapulted as well. Let's move on. So for parents, what are action steps, particularly even as we're coming out of COVID, is, take advantage of time at home. Talk openly about your own fears, uncertainties, and disappointments, and particularly with COVID, with so many people losing jobs, most of them, women, acknowledging the particular challenges boys feel about being vulnerable and the courage it takes for them to express it. Curate family media, avoid media that reinforces this man box. I think it's really important for parents to watch what their kids are watching and be able to use that to have a discussion, particularly if there is a scene and there's physical violence. Can you talk to them about, was there another way that they could have handled this conflict? And modeling healthy behaviors, reinforcing that it's okay to need help and ask for it. And again, particularly in light of all the suicide rates that have shot up, during COVID, encouraging the need to ask for help is really a life or death matter. And then also self-care. Most of us have all experienced during COVID the lack of self-care while we're trying to care for our family members, and particularly if they've become, ill. And taking mental health seriously. One of the things that we noticed that's not part of this study is that when it comes to, media and mental health in kids programming, there aren't any characters or shows in TV. There's only one show that I can name where they ever showed one of the fictional characters having an anxiety attack. So definitely representing mental health in children's programming as a view or window into helping them navigate is really important. Let's move on. And then action steps for content creators, which is, clearly the lane that we operate in, is, using this study to help them avoid these stereotypes, avoiding gratuitous violence, showing other ways to handle conflict resolution, having male characters express a full range of emotion, not just violence, showing boys and men asking for help, particularly from parents, showing that there are parents that are supervising, that are engaging in the lives of their boys, showing boys and girls share the sandbox, showing boys being caring and having close relationships, showing boys doing household chores, that it's not women's work, and also showing a range of gender identities. So I think that is my last slide. And again, I think Gary had mentioned this. last year. So in the former presentation. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Madeline, for those comments, and for you and your team for working on the study with us, and using it to really, bring an X-ray into how harmful ideas about gender and gender power and power imbalances and unhealthy ideas of masculinities and racism are all too, unfortunately, alive and well in a lot of the television that's produced. And we're pleased to continue partnering around how do we take these conversations to content makers. So this is not just, us making noise from outside, but obligating them to be in the room with us so that this influences how they make and how they make content. I highlighted very quickly that we've also been very mindful of how much time boys and young men spend on online gaming platforms, and very aware, because of a number of feminist activists who have taken on the gaming industry, that we're working together with Madeline and her team, supported by the Oak Foundation, to do a study of the largest gaming platform, Twitch, and the content both in the games themselves, as well as in the chat function, as well as a national survey of young men's participation in gaming. And I won't share those results. Those will be launched in the next 2 months, but just to say the amount of misogyny as well as white supremacy is sadly and tragically alive and well in those spaces. There's a few voices of resistance we're going to build on, but we will share those results and also share how we're hoping to dialogue and push against the gaming industry to become an ally for gender justice and racial justice. I'm looking at time. I know that we've all been on for quite a long time, seeing that a couple of folks had to bow out. I just want to extend a quick thanks to everybody, again, to the MenEngage Global Secretariat and the Symposium folks for bringing all that they've brought to us these past months and for allowing us to have this session. I want to thank again all the panelists for the work that you do and for inspiring what we're trying to do with the Global Boyhood Initiative. And thank all of you for participating in the discussion room and for the rich amount of suggestions and resources that you've been sharing in the chat room. This is not the end of this conversation. We see this initiative with its big name and trying to be global, of really a dialogue between and learning from lots of us. So we want to continue that process. We as Promundo see the need to promote a feminist, connected, justice-seeking boyhood as not an optional, but an imperative that must go along with all of our other feminist activism and programming. And we're thrilled again to partner with the Caring Foundation on this. So let me stop there. I want to thank all the Promundo team, Alexa in particular, Tolu and others for organizing all this. And then I want to give the last word to Celine. Celine, over to you, and then we'll close out.
Nothing to add, Gary. It was a great session. Very interesting to see all the initiatives that are already going on in different countries. And I saw that Tolu shared the resources about the Global Boyhood Initiative. So please, if you have any suggestion or ideas, do not hesitate to contact us and to share best practices as you have so much experience on these topics. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone. And we will be in touch, and you've got the links there of how to stay in conversation with us, which we sincerely hope you do. Bianca, thanks again for all the logistics and making this flow smoothly.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Gary, and thanks to all the speakers and Alexa for organizing the session. Just to let you all know that the sessions continue. You can see menengage.org/symposium, and you can get the agenda there, and it keeps going all the way through until the 22nd of June. And we will have the final closing event ceremony on June 22nd. So just thank you again to everyone, and we hope to see you soon. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.